Okay, guys, so for this session, we are going to be talking about political parties in Texas. So this chapter is kind of interesting because we talk about both the history of where Texas has been in terms of political parties and also where it's headed moving forward. So let's just start by talking about how we have a really long one-party tradition in Texas. So when we say one-party tradition, what we mean is for a very long time, we've been really controlled and dominated by one political party. Under the Republic of Texas, there was very little party activity. Political divisions were usually oriented around support of or opposition to Sam Houston, who was a founding leader in the Republic. After Texas became a state, though, the Democratic Party dominated Texas politics until around the 1980s. So originally, we were a very liberal state. Now we tend to be more of a very conservative state. And just as a reminder from chapter 1, when we were talking about different ideologies, liberals believe that it is often necessary for government to regulate the economy and to promote greater social equality. Conservatives believe that individuals should be left alone to compete in a free market, unfettered by government control. They prefer that government regulation of the economy be kept to a minimum. In terms of which issues are prioritized, there are two different types of issues that these parties can choose to focus on. The first are valence issues, and the second are going to be position issues. So valence issues are issues on which virtually all of the public agrees. So examples of this would be peace and prosperity, or we want a more educated population. Those tend to be things that people are generally in agreement on, whether they're conservative or whether they're liberal. Position issues are issues on which the public is divided. Examples of this would be things like immigration, abortion, the death penalty, gun control. Those would all be examples of position issues. Now, it used to be that candidates who were successful focused on pragmatism. And this was really the philosophy that ideas should be judged on the basis of their practical results, rather than on the purity of their principles, which meant that you had a lot more people in positions of power who were willing to cross party lines on a particular political issue, and who were also willing to focus on valence issues. Most political observers think that American parties, and the parties in Texas, have become more programmatic and more polarized in recent years, focusing much more on those position issues than the valence issues. Now, understand, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later in the chapter, that the parties in Texas are really operating under decentralization. And decentralization is exercise of power at the state and local levels of government in addition to the national level. So if we wanted to, as Texas voters, we could enact change in this. You always hear people talking about how polarized things are. We're going to talk in a little bit about how potentially they could not be that polarized if more people would engage in the political process. Okay, so until the 1990s, conservative Democrats were the ones who were really successful in Texas. And they had the backing of the power and resources of a conservative constituency. So to understand why we were Democratic for so long, you have to go back in history to the era of the Civil War and Reconstruction. So remember, Reconstruction was when the South was basically being rebuilt, and it was not a very popular time in the South. South had just been defeated, the Confederacy had not won, and people were very upset. And they generally saw the people who were coming in from the union and leadership positions as being exploitative. And so they were very much not a fan of people in positions of power who were all Republican at that time. So the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. As a result of that, on a statewide level, you started to see a lot of distrust of the Republican Party. So you saw more people gravitating towards the Democrats. If you think back to Chapter 3, Governor E.J. Davis, remember he was a Republican too. So that was also part of what led this push towards a more democratic Texas. Now, over time, this changed and evolved, really starting in the 50s and 60s, and then gradually transitioning as time went on. So let's take a look at that gradual transition that I'm talking about. In 1961, this is when we really see the start of the rise of the Republican Party. That's when John Tower is going to be elected to the U.S. Senate. So what's kind of notable and interesting about this is that John Tower was actually filling the vacancy that was left by LBJ, who was a Democrat. So it's a little bit ironic. But that's where we first start to see the rise of the Republican Party. Then in 1978, you see Bill Clements elected as governor, who was the first governor to hold statewide office who was a Republican in quite some time. From there, it's going to go back and forth. You're going to see this toggle between Republican and Democratic governors. 1992 is when Republicans hold both U.S. Senate seats. And in 1998, Republicans win every statewide election. This was when George W. Bush was governor, and so it was a really big deal that he was able to unify Texas behind the Republican Party, part of what helped get him the nomination for the presidency. So you can see that this is a gradual process. So how does this era of Republican prominence come to be? Well, the first thing that you have to understand about any type of party identification is, what is partisan identification? What is the definition of that? Partisan identification is a person's attachment to one political party or the other. Somebody identifies themselves as either Republican or Democrat, that becomes a part of their self-identity. It's how they view themselves in relation to the world. So it's really hard to change that perception overnight, to go from saying, well, I was a Democrat, but now I'm a Republican, or I was a Republican, but now I'm a Democrat. So what you usually see first is a process of de-alignment. De-alignment is when increasing numbers of voters choose not to identify with either of the two parties, and they consider themselves to be independent. Now, here's what's interesting about that. They're not actually independent. If you start going in and asking those individuals specific questions, how do you feel about immigration? How do you feel about gun control? How do you feel about the death penalty? How do you feel about all of those position issues that we were talking about? You're going to find that they're actually starting to tilt more towards the other political party. But it's a little too scary for them to just say that overnight. So first, they identify themselves as independents in this process of de-alignment. Next, they move on to party realignment. This is the long-term transition from a system in which one party is consistently dominant to one in which another party is consistently dominant. So what you saw in that 1961 to 1998 slide, that's the process of realignment. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens gradually. This next slide here is just designed to show you, this was John Tower's 1961 campaign flyer. So it's kind of interesting to go back and look and see which ideas were salient then that are still salient today. So which ones were relevant then that are still relevant now. And so you'll see things like states' rights that are still very much a part of the Republican Party platform, local school control. There's going to be some that aren't, like the Office of Un-American Activities. We don't have that anymore in the modern Republican Party. But a lot of these campaign positions have actually remained pretty consistent. Some of what hasn't remained consistent in the Republican and Democratic policies is going to have to do with racial tensions, which is part of why we see the transition start to happen in the 1960s over to Democrats. So during this period of time, the Democrats, with LBJ in office, they're the ones who are pushing through the VRA, the Voting Rights Act that we talked about. They're also the ones who are going to be pushing through the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was basically designed to end discrimination in things like housing and employment, areas such as that. So on the whole, it was relatively unpopular in the South. And so you start to see a gradual transition away from the Democratic Party and more towards the Republican Party. So some of those issues, in fact, a lot of those issues remain the same that you see in that 1961 campaign flyer, but you're also going to see a gradual move in some of the party's policy positions as well. Okay, let's go here. So let's talk about where the state is currently. We've got areas of strong Republican support and we've got areas of weak Republican support. Those areas of strong Republican support you see listed here: the Houston suburbs, Fort Worth and its suburbs, West Texas, north of I-10, East Texas, Hill Country, Edwards Plateau area. Weak Republican support areas, which basically just means areas that are controlled by the Democrats. Those are going to be South Central Texas, Austin, Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and the border region, far West Texas, so El Paso, as well as the Rio Grande Valley. Those areas of strong Republican support, when you're looking at those, they tend to be more rural, right? And the areas of weak Republican support, those tend to be more urban. Why this is important is that over time, Texas is seeing increased urbanization. And the more urban an area is, statistically speaking, the more likely it is to become Democrat. So this is one of the things that you're going to see referenced when political scientists say that in the future, they anticipate that the state of Texas might be moving back to being a Democratic state, which for a lot of people is probably going to be a surprising revelation, because most of us have probably just become very accustomed to the idea that the state is going to be and remain Republican. But that's not necessarily where the state is headed. Political scientists actually think that there is a good chance that we are moving towards a Democratic state, and part of that has to do with that increased urbanization. Another factor that they're going to look at is the percentage of voters who are indicating a major party identification. So if we go back to 1952, when we had really strong control by the Democrats, we saw 66% of the population identifying as Democrat and only 6% identifying as Republican. Fast forward now and look at 2018 and what's going on there. That split does not look nearly as different as what we might anticipate seeing. So part of what's probably going to account for that, right, is think about how few individuals are actually turning out to vote. So even if we have what looks like a pretty clear split between Democrats and Republicans with a little bit of a lean towards the Republican side, you're probably not going to see that play out in the polls if you've got a whole lot of people who just aren't showing up at the end of the day. So part of what's going to make a difference is whether or not people actually show up to vote. This next slide that we have here is going to show you the results of the 2016 presidential election. So in red, we've got all of the counties that went for Trump. In blue, we've got all of the counties that went for Clinton. Obviously, you can see here that the overwhelming majority went for Trump, which is what we would expect to see in Texas. But if any of you were watching while those election results were coming in, Texas was actually a little bit surprising because at the beginning, Texas was actually leaning more heavily towards Clinton than Trump. Now, everybody who was on there analyzing it knew that eventually Texas was going to switch over to Trump. But when it did, we saw a margin of victory that was very low, the lowest we've seen since the 90s for Texas. And it was a 9% margin, which feels like a fair amount, but in context is the first time that we've seen a single-digit victory of the Republicans on the national stage in Texas since the 1990s. So that decreasing margin of victory is something that political scientists are looking at really closely to figure out whether the state might end up becoming Democratic again. And really, like we'd referenced earlier, the current presidential election is going to be interesting because right now, the Texas Tribune's polling numbers show Trump about 5 points ahead. And then some later polls that came out after are actually showing Biden ahead by 1 point. So it looks like that contest right now in May of 2020 is pretty close. Now, it might change here in the future. I have no idea. I don't think anybody knows what's happening at any point in the future right now, or how to make any type of plans. But that is something that political scientists are paying pretty close attention to. Okay, so here we have a picture of Ted Cruz. And why we have a picture of Ted Cruz is because part of why people think that the Republican Party might stop being dominant has to do with what is happening within the Republican Party today and the battle over the party platform. So the party platform is just the formal issue positions of a political party. Specific elements of that are often referred to as planks in the party's platform. There are two groups within the Republican Party that are really combating each other for control over what that party platform is going to look like. So which planks are going to be emphasized? We've got the fundamentalist Christian sect of the Republican Party, and we also have the Tea Party sect. The fundamentalist Christians are a very vocal bloc of conservative Christians who are concerned with more social issues. So family, religion, abortion, gay rights, community morals, all of those things are party planks that they want to see emphasized. The Tea Party is a faction or group of very conservative Republicans who are generally resistant to any compromise of their economic principles. So they very much want the government to be hands-off when it comes to the economy. So they were opposed to the financial bailouts of 2008 that helped out large corporations as well as big banks. They were opposed to Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act that we studied, where we went in and basically said everyone had to have health insurance. If they don't have health insurance, there's a penalty associated with that. So they're very much hands-off when it comes to economic policies. So the Tea Party wants to see economic policies emphasized, and the evangelical Christians would really like to see social policies emphasized. Ted Cruz, as we all know, was elected by a pretty narrow margin of victory this last campaign season. But part of why he was reelected and part of why he's been a popular choice in Texas and in conservative circles is that he is supported by both the Christian conservatives and the Tea Party activists. So he's been able to unite those two factions within the Republican Party, which is something that Texas Republicans have been struggling with. A really good example of this played out in the Texas legislature, not this last legislative session, but the session before. So in that previous legislative session, we had seen Dan Patrick really pushing for that LGBTQ bathroom bill, the one that said you have to use the restroom of the gender that you were assigned at birth. You don't have any level of preference as to which bathroom choice you're going to make. Well, Joe Straus is a Republican, and he was Speaker of the House at the time. And he basically said, I'm not concerned about this. Like, I'm way more concerned about financial things. And I'm basically just going to kill this bill in the House, which was exceptionally unpopular with the evangelical faction of the conservative movement. As a result of that, this last legislative session, Joe Straus was no longer Speaker of the House. Instead, we saw the election of a new Speaker of the House, Joe Straus. So this is something that the Texas Republican Party has been struggling with and has created some level of division, and that we see potentially the Democrats might take advantage of. Other factors that are going to influence whether or not Texas Democrats are able to compete is going to be that growing Latino population. So Latino voters are largely known as swing voters. They're voters who are not bound by party identification and who support candidates of different parties in different election years. Technically, when it comes to social issues, polling shows that Latinos tend to be more conservative. So when it comes to things like abortion and LGBTQ issues, they tend to be more conservative than liberal. But when it comes to things like immigration, affirmative action, social welfare programs, they tend to be more liberal. And on the whole, if you think back on that chart that we looked at in Chapter 1, if you're a Latino, statistically speaking, you're much more likely to lean Democrat than Republican. We have enough Latinos in the state because remember from Chapter 1, we have that rising Latino population that pretty soon the majority of the Texas population is going to be Latino. We have enough of that Latino population that something could occur called tipping. Tipping is a phenomenon that occurs when a demographic group grows large enough to change the political balance in the electorate. So the fact that historically we've seen more Latinos vote for the Democrats than the Republicans means that potentially if our Latino population continues to grow and our Latino population shows up to vote, that Latino population could actually control and tip the state of Texas over to the Democratic Party as opposed to the Republicans. And this next picture is just illustrating that for you. So the dark blue is going to be those counties that we see the most Latinos in, and then going all the way up into shades where white is going to be the lowest number. But you can see here that we've got quite a lot of counties that have a very large Latino population, which might eventually lead itself towards tipping. Okay. This next slide is really designed to demonstrate for you how regular people could potentially influence and affect the political issues and the partisanship that's occurring today in Texas as well as national politics. So Well, we talked about how Texas has really low voter turnout to begin with. Well, that turnout gets even lower when we talk about people who show up to vote in the primary. So the number of people who show up to vote for who's going to actually end up on that general election ballot is very, very low. But if you do show up to that, then you get an automatic ticket to the precinct convention. The precinct convention is basically the lowest level of party organization in the state of Texas. Why that's important, though, is that precinct convention is where we start choosing delegates to go up to the higher levels of the convention. It's only when you get to the highest level of the convention that you're going to be able to shape the party platform. So we have very few people showing up to that primary to begin with. And of the individuals who are showing up to the primary, most of the people who are showing up are either strongly conservative or strongly liberal. So they're very strident and very far right or far left in their viewpoints. Because most people who fall somewhere in the middle aren't showing up. And then those people who take that ticket and go to the precinct convention, that becomes even smaller. And the partisanship becomes even deeper. So this chart really illustrates to you how if you're motivated to make a change and show less partisanship, show more moderate policies being endorsed, voting and then attending the precinct convention, the only way you can be chosen to be a delegate who can eventually move up to the higher levels. And so at the state convention level, then you could eventually affect some type of permanent change. So this is going to be Chapter 5. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. We can email. We can also set up a Blackboard Collaborate session at any time.